Hi. Greetings. This is the first of a series of podcasts concerning US foreign policy during the global war on terror, and sometimes a little beyond that range. I'm basing this series on a lecture that I recently prepared for the Cleveland Peace Action Group, which is connected to a national network of peace action groups. But I have extended it fairly considerably since then. So to get started, I am Oliver Boyd-Barrett. I am a professor emeritus of Bowling Green State University, Ohio, also of California Polytechnic University, based in Pomona, California. And this series is coming to you from the old Chumash territory of Ojai in California. So I'm going to be using the screen share facility quite a bit during these lectures. And here goes. So as you see, I was invited to address the Cleveland Peace Action on September the 14th, 2021. The topic was War, Peace and Propaganda, the USA in the Middle East. And that title is good enough for this series as well. I am broadcasting this first lecture on September the 26th, 2021. I thought it would be useful for any of my viewers and listeners just to see the goals of the Cleveland Peace Action Group, since they largely represent my own aspirations for a better foreign policy for the future. So Cleveland Peace Action is a convergence of people that are committed to ending violence and promoting justice through education, advocacy, and action. They want to see the ending of wars and of US military interventions, replacing them with engagement and diplomacy in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Venezuela, and Iran. They want to cut Pentagon spending and redirect those funds for human needs such as education, housing, transportation, and healthcare. I would also add climate change. In fact, I would put climate change in the right at the front of that list. They want peace with justice for all in the Middle East, and in particular, an end to the oppression of the Palestinians. They want to reduce and ultimately abolish nuclear weapons worldwide. They want to partner with local groups to end violence and injustice in our communities and to work for environmental justice and addressing global climate change. So my aim is to keep these lectures to approximately half an hour per lecture, and this is the first. So let me perhaps spend most of this opening half hour introducing you to the broad scope of my argument. What I'm doing here is establishing an overall framework of the history of US interventionism and regime change. I want to argue that at least since World War II, this history has been fairly uninterrupted. Some people will argue that there was a pause after the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. But I'm inclined to think that there were interventions going on all of the time, even if there was a relative slowdown after the Vietnam War, until some dramatic interventions began to reappear, at least on the media horizon, in terms of the invasion of Grenada, then the US intervention in Panama, for sure, in 1989 definitely began to signal a revised trend back to fairly overt and dramatic interventions. The point of starting this history from World War II is simply that it's better known. I am more familiar with it, but the history is much older. It probably predates World War II by 100 years, back to the early US interventions and provocations that occurred in Mexico, that ultimately led to the ceding to the United States of a vast swath of Mexican territory that greatly reduced the overall size of that nation back in the mid-19th century. And we can see it again very dramatically in the follow-up to the war with Spain in the 1890s, and the US occupation of Cuba, and later and possession of previously Spanish territories, most notably the Philippines, which the United States invaded and occupied for approximately half a century. So when we review the history of US interventions, we should note that although we may think it's primarily interventions in the so-called third world or the developing world, or amongst emerging nations, or whatever other descriptive term one wants to give to those parts of the world that are somewhat less industrialized, somewhat less economically prosperous than the United States. It's healthy to bear in mind that some of these interventions also occurred in the First World. So some of the most notable, to my mind, are US intervention in European elections in the immediate post-Second World War era, which were inspired in part by the ambition to reduce the claims to power of European communist parties. Most of these were somewhat distanced from the policies of the Soviet Union. They were all ultimately to become very much distanced from the Soviet Union following the end of the Stalin era. But I'm thinking of the interventions in elections in Italy and in France during the 1940s. I'm also interested in the involvement or the knowledge of US intelligence with respect to attempts in Great Britain to unseat Labour Party Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister for two periods from 1968 to 1976, during which time he was subject to a potential or to a planned coup d'etat led by Lord Mountbatten, close relative to the Queen of England. With the support of some media tycoons, they included the editor of the supposed left-wing Labour Party related Daily Mirror, Hugh Cudlip, and the owner of the Daily Mirror. There was also a campaign of harassment towards the end of his era, seeking to enmesh him in a scandal, unfounded, in which his personal secretary, Lady Falklander, was involved, was implicated. There was also the attempted US coup in Greece. The CIA was very much behind the coming to power of the Greek colonels in 1967 until 1974. William Blum, who's one of those who's chronicled this succession of US interventions over the post-Second World War era, he counted 50, but I think that's a wild underestimate, or at least he deals with only 50. I'm sure he was aware that there were many other candidates. But he has a very good description of the US involvement, the CIA involvement behind the coup in Greece that brought the colonels to power in 1967. He describes Greece as fundamentally a CIA outpost. Practically everything that was going on in Greece before, during, and probably after those years was in the control or under the significant influence of the CIA station chief in Athens. There was there was a successful attempt to, or a successful bid to remove the Labour Party chief Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, which occurred in 1975. Amongst his other sins, Whitlam was ambitious to reduce US exploitation of Australia as an intelligence or surveillance base on behalf of the United States against countries like China and Asia more generally. There was also, somewhat later, but there was also a CIA involvement in an attempt to bring down a similarly Labour-affiliated party in New Zealand in the early 1980s. Again, part of the problem was an interest in New Zealand to reduce its involvement, its implication within a US-led surveillance intelligence empire. So when we see the United States involved in bids to destabilize first world countries, we can ask, why should we be surprised to find equally egregious or more egregious attempts in the third world to unseat parties in power, or in other ways to manipulate electoral and other political outcomes. Some of the most outstanding interventions in the countries of the South include, but of course are by no means limited to, in the case of the Middle East, which is particularly relevant here, a string of CIA or CIA involvement in a string of coup attempts in Syria. There's the assassination of President Lumumba of the Congo in 1961. There is CIA involvement in the overthrow of the founding father of Indonesian independence in 1967, which brought to power a much Western-friendly regime of Sukarno, or of Suharto, I should say. The shooing into power of Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 1980, conveniently just a few months after the arrival to power in Iran of Khomeini, leader of the Islamic Revolution of 1979. One of the first things that Saddam Hussein did when he achieved power in Iraq was to start a war, very conveniently from the US point of view, with Iran, a war that ran for 8.5 years. There was US involvement in Chile in 1973. I should quickly point out, of course, that very frequently, if not usually, these involvements in destabilization and coup attempts also implicate not just the United States, but other Western powers and members of NATO. See many US interventions in Central America throughout this period. Nicaragua in 1981, merely 6 years following the US defeat in Vietnam. Then Grenada, as I mentioned earlier, in 1983, Panama in 1989, and the US beating of the drums for war very insistently against Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War of 1990 to 1991, and then US involvement in the breakup of Yugoslavia and the subsequent wars of secession that occurred through the Balkans in the 1990s. So as we review this period from World War II to the end of the Soviet era, which was 1990 to 1991, we can revisit the presumption that international conflicts throughout this period were dominated by an existential and passionate struggle that we call the Cold War, principally between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. And the Cold War is commonly interpreted as being a war between the claims of two opposed economic systems, namely communism and capitalism. Communism in the case of the Soviet Union, and capitalism in the case of in the case of the United States. There is an argument, an alternative argument, that it was never really about, it wasn't so much about the conflict between communism and capitalism. And after all, those two systems, those two economic systems, seem to be potentially merging even in the 70s and 80s as Western countries liberalize, we might say, in the sense of introducing more and more significant advantages for the working class in terms of protections and pensions and health care, education, and these other important facets of entitlements that have were in these years being given to the advanced, to the working classes. And as the Soviet Union from time to time began to loosen its economic practices to allow various forms of profit making, in private profit making, we can argue that the conflict between communism and capitalism, at least at times during this period, has been exaggerated by historians, and that in fact these were two definitely different economic systems, but economic systems that were veering in a similar direction. We see the development of a sort of a form of state capitalism in the Soviet Union, and in the West, particularly in Western Europe, first and foremost in Western Europe, but then also in the United States, a movement towards a socialized form of capitalism. So were these two systems ever, were the differences between these two systems ever as important and as existential as most of the global population who lived through this period were led to believe? Or was it instead, was the struggle actually a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States for influence throughout the South, or throughout the third world or the developing world, particularly those parts of that world or those worlds which had not yet definitively affiliated with either camp? And was it even more than a quest for affiliation and support from the third world? Was it actually a competition to gain influence and control over and access to and control over the mineral wealth and other sources of wealth in these countries, or at least to prevent their opponents from obtaining access and control over these other sources of wealth in those countries? If it was a struggle between communism and capitalism, then we have to ask, why is the struggle between Russia, the obvious successor to the Soviet Union, and the United States still so intense today, when it's clear that Russia has transitioned more or less entirely to a capitalist system following the demise of communism and the Soviet Union in 1990 to 1991. And also, should we not be surprised if there has been increasing tension between China and the United States, even though it's been patently obvious for several decades that China has had a strong commitment to becoming a capitalist economic system, albeit one that is principally steered and controlled by the Communist Party of China. So if the conflict wasn't between capitalism and communism, and if now that both Russia and the United States are capitalist and China is clearly capitalist to a significant degree, with China having more billionaires, for example, than most other countries of the world, if not more than in most other countries of the world. So if it isn't a struggle between communism and capitalism, what is it? Well, we've looked at the possibility that it was a struggle for the third world, and perhaps that argument still has some merit. But I'm inclined to think that this is a struggle for hegemony. It's principally a struggle for hegemony by the United States, and this would conform to the dynamics of competitive political power, wherein a competitive leader, in this instance the United States being the strongest power since, at least since World War II, if not from before then, has to struggle very, very hard to maintain its position of superiority and strength over other powers. So that we see the United States apparently acting more aggressively, with greater persistence and determination to establish or to maintain its hegemony, than the effort, the investment of rival powers who seem merely to be acting more defensively, less aggressively, merely wishing to establish their legitimate stamp on the international order arising from whatever economic, political, and cultural power they have been able to make manifest. So, looking at this problematic from the year 2021, we're looking at a situation where the evidence of power conflict is once again very, very visible. That conflict used to be principally manifest between the United States and Russia. China was always there in the background, but China did not have nearly the equivalent economic power of the United States and Russia in this period, and it certainly had very, very little by way of nuclear power, which today is a very important underpinning to Russia's continuing claim to power and influence around the world. So we can see today this struggle principally between the United States, China, which is much more important than Russia, and Russia. Amidst a narrative which ever more frequently seems to suggest that the United States is in a stage of decline. Although militarily, there can be no doubt that the United States remains #1 military power on the world stage, particularly when all of its military assets are lined up with those of its allies, particularly its NATO allies and its allies in the Asian area. And that is a network of strength for the United States that every day more includes India. which is almost as populous a country as is China. We've seen, as I speak in September 2021, we've seen a recent apparent withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan. This is quite a recent development. It was negotiated by former President Trump in 2020. It was executed with a slight extension by a few months in 2021 and occurred in August 2021. There are constant murmurs of an equivalent withdrawal of the United States from Iraq and from Syria. That's later on in this series, we had to address, first of all, is this apparent period of quiescence by the hegemonic military power? Is this real? Can it be substantiated with actual evidence? Is it likely to last? In as much as it can be said to exist, what degree of importance should we attach to it? All right, so when we get to the end of the series, I'm going to return to that question. So before I conclude this first lecture of the series, I'm going to outline at least some of what I call the constants. So as we review this history of US interventionism, particularly as it has been manifest over the period of the so-called global war on terror, the GWOT. Here are some of the repetitive patterns I think we can generally find, and then later on, when I deal with specific interventions, I will be able to illustrate these constants, not necessarily illustrating every one of these constants in relation to every particular arena of intervention, but certainly illustrating some of these. So here they are. The pretexts that the United States and its NATO allies give for the interventions in which they participate are nearly always false or simply misleading. Secondly, the pretexts that they provide increasingly appear to weaponize ideologies of such things as human rights and women's rights. Not only are these claims deeply hypocritical as a general rule, because human rights and women's rights are generally not a significant reason for why the United States and its Western allies engage in interventions. But even if they were supposedly intended to improve human rights and women's rights, they frequently do little or nothing to actually secure these in a safe and predictable long-term fashion. The wars that the United States and its Western allies engage are increasingly wars of perception management and propaganda that accompany the threat and the execution of military might. And these are wars that are fought through government agencies, through compliant media, which is practically all mainstream media, if any mainstream media. There are no mainstream media that fail to pull their punches when it comes to narrating the reality of US and its allies, the foreign policy, military and interventionist foreign policies of the United States and its allies. These are wars of information and perception and propaganda that are fought through think tanks and human rights organizations, non-government organizations, which in this context are nearly always government organizations taking money from various Western governments. Fourth constant, the United States government consistently lies about its conflicts before, during, and after they occur. Fifth, mainstream media, as I said a moment ago, generally act as stenographers to power. They do this in a wide variety of ways, and we need to discuss these. They typically, one of the most important ways in which they aid the foreign policies of their respective governments is to obscure or even to completely hide the actual in-depth context in which these conflicts occur. They always misrepresent, when they don't entirely ignore, the narratives of the opponent forces or the forces to which the Western nations are opposed. The only winners to these conflicts are what Ray McGovern, a former CIA analyst, has labeled the Mickey Mat. The Mickey Mat is an updating of the older term military-industrial complex, which was brought to us by Republican President Eisenhower shortly before he handed power over to J.F. Kennedy. McGovern's version is the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. The United States has spent, since 2001, an estimated $7 trillion on this complex. So most of the money of war is paid to those who work within this complex. I call it the incubus, that mammoth, that massive, ugly monster that's strapped to our backs, and we have yet to find a way of cutting ourselves loose. So of that 7 trillion, the defense industry itself takes about half, has taken about half since 2001, since the period of the so-called global war on terror. Pretty much everyone loses, other than those who take their salaries and other goodies from Mickey Mat. So all of this money is essentially coming from US taxpayer and the taxpayers of the countries of US allies. In terms of the interests, the real interests, I would argue, of the American people and of global security, the actual outcomes of these interventions are hideously counterproductive. So we need to, I will illustrate that theme as this series advances. The foreign policy of the United States has developed more and more as a hybrid of what I call Machiavellian realpolitik It's a machismo world, playing this game of Machiavellian realpolitik. That's only real men play that game. The culture would have us believe. The militaristic culture of the United States would have us believe. But it's a marriage of Machiavellian realpolitik with ideological, what I would call fundamentalist presumptions of the superiority of white Western civilization, which traces its history back rather dubiously, I think, or to the rather dubious saints of this narrative, such as the Roman and Greek civilizations and their respective empires. The overall solution to the problem that we face when we look at this unending history of US interventionism, other people sometimes refer to it as US exceptionalism, but that's a little bit less precise. I'm going to argue it's the solution that we're looking for lies in the area of a wholesale cultural revolution that is opposed to militarism. So we need to think about some of the circumstances and means whereby such an outcome could be fostered. So at that point, as you see, I'm indicating where the series of lectures will move to next time. I am going to close this first episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.